While we're waiting for people to get settled, we have a demo to present showing a little bit of what agents can do when they interact with each other.
Hi, I'm Adam Binksmith from AI Digest, and I'd like to give you a brief demo of our Agent Village project. You can see here we have 4 AI agents. These are language models from OpenAI and from Anthropic. And we've given each of them a computer that they can use. We've also given them a group chat, which you can see on the right here, where they can talk to each other and also human users who are dropping by on the website. And the goal here was to understand how current agents can pursue long-term open-ended goals. And so with that in mind, we gave them the goal: choose a charity and raise as much money for it as you can. We then have been running them for about 2 hours a day, every day for the last 30 days. And I'll give you a brief description of a few of the interesting things that have happened and kind of what that tells us about computer use capabilities at the moment. So one thing to note is that currently agents are not very capable at computer use. For example, the least capable of the agents we've had in the village, GPT-4o, struggles to understand its environment in some settings. It struggles to, for example, it created a Google document, it's trying to share it using the interface there, and it will get confused and have trouble navigating this element of typing and then selecting something from a dropdown. But we've also seen that the more capable models and the newer models that have been coming out recently have been substantially more capable at this in this kind of environment. So Claude 3.7 Sonnet has been able to string together a series of actions and make substantial progress on this goal. So you can see here it's running an AMA where fans are asking questions on Twitter as part of its efforts to promote the fundraiser. It created a fundraising page through the platform Just Giving and ended up raising around $2,000 over the course of the 30 days that it's been running. We've seen the agents create lots of Google documents. They are very enthusiastic and often celebrate each other's actions. But I think the thing to notice here is that the trend is, a year ago, agents wouldn't even have been able to identify what element to click on the screen. If they wanted to click on a button, they wouldn't have been able to locate it. And now we're seeing that over the course of this period, they're being able to make serious progress on the goal. We hope that the Agent Village will continue being a useful way to see these capabilities as they emerge, and we'll see what happens next in terms of computer use capabilities.
Welcome everyone to our panel briefing on progress and policy implications of advanced agentic AI. I'm Jason Green-Lowe, the Executive Director of the Center for AI Policy. I'll be hosting these experts who have come to have a discussion today about where AI agents are, where they'll be soon, and what it means and what Congress can do about that. The particular purpose of our organization is to call Congress's attention to some of the catastrophic risks of advanced artificial intelligence. We saw from the demo just now that the agents are not quite at the point of causing catastrophic risks. They're kind of about as good at manipulating some of these browsers as some of our grandparents. But they're doubling quickly, right? The research suggests that the length of time that an agent can complete a task without human supervision is about an hour, and that's been doubling about every 7 months. So if you double it 7 months, 12 times, that's 7 years from now, that's a factor of 4,000. At that point, the agent can work for 2 years in between pieces of human supervision, and 2 years is longer than 7 months, so by the time it hits the end of its runway, it may have improved to the point where it can just continue working anyway. So we could be 7 years away from the end of human supervision of agents at all. It might be longer, right? Predicting the future is always difficult without a crystal ball, but we could be running into a world where things will change very, very quickly. And so part of my organization's job is to try to get Congress ready to cope with some of those possibilities. That's not what the whole conversation will be about today. We're going to provide a full spectrum briefing on all different kinds of policy implications of advanced agentic AI. And we've brought together a panel with a lot of different kinds of expertise that can help us with that. So on my far left is Atoosa Kasirzadeh. She is an assistant professor of philosophy and software and societal systems at Carnegie Mellon, has 2 different PhDs, and has been publishing on how to think about what it means for an agent to be autonomous and what we can expect from agents and how we can get good social outcomes as agents continue to be integrated into our society. On my immediate left is Kerr. She is a senior research fellow at the National Defense University and has worked with Brookings and is a professor at Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and an affiliate with the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. I would need to use agents to get all of that work done. But she may be more productive than I am. So she's been studying the information environment. What do agents do to our ability to share correct and believable information? And how can we cope with some of those changes? And I'm excited to see what she has to tell us about that. On my immediate right is Michael Boyce. He stood up the Department of Homeland Security AI Corps, recruiting 50 specialists in less than a year and delivering a variety of successful projects. Before that, he was working on AI and cybersecurity policy and finding ways to streamline border operations, detect fraud, predict workload. I shamelessly stole the model he built at the Department of Homeland Security for the model legislation that my center is promoting, because I really do think it's just the most effective way of getting technical talent into the government, and I believe we still need more of it. Finally, on my far right is Kraprayoon. He is an AI policy researcher at the Institute for AI Policy and Strategy, as well as a fellow at the Federation of American Scientists. He has a long career having worked on regulating emerging technology in a wide variety of countries across Asia, has seen firsthand how they wind up impacting societies and what we can do about it, and recently finished authoring an extensive field guide to AI agent governance, which is where some of the statistics I quoted in my intro were shamelessly stolen from, and that can help us understand what it means that agents are advancing rapidly and how we can think about addressing the governance gaps that will probably arise as a result. So just to set the scene and provide a little additional context beyond what we had in the intro video, I want to ask our panelists what the most useful thing is that they've seen an AI agent do so far, and what the weirdest or most surprising thing is that they've seen an AI agent do so far. And I'll start with Atoosa.
Great. If I want to mention one example, and it's an example that I kind of prototyped before, there's a universal AI assistant developed by Google DeepMind called Astra. And this AI assistant is also known as an AI agent. And this universal AI assistant is supposed to help you to do so many different things. It accepts a variety of different modalities of data, including text, video, image, and you can ask all types of questions from this specific AI agent. So agent can be incorporated in terms of an app. You can use your mobile phone to talk to the system, or just take an image of, let's say, an instruction for washing a clothes from your like an instruction in Japanese. Let's assume you don't speak Japanese. This instruction is tagged on your clothes, and you ask, what is this? The agent is going to help you. You can take the agent outside. Let's say you're walking from point A to B, and then you don't know exactly the specific path, and ask whether there is a supermarket here. All kinds of questions you can ask from this universal assistant. One very interesting thing about this universal assistant is that there is, again, a prototype where this agent is actually incorporated into the frame of a glass, so you can wear the specific glass and basically talk to this agent wherever you go. Again, the agent can process a variety of different modalities. And again, this system has not been rolled out publicly. There are various different trusted users that are experimenting with this system, but I think there's like a huge promise for this system if it becomes available to public.
Thank you. Let's carry on down the line.
Well, I work for the Department of Defense. I'm a DoD civilian. I'm a senior research fellow, faculty member at National Defense University. So I work on emerging technologies and digital technologies in that in relationship to conflict and national security a lot in my research. And been doing a lot of work these last couple of years looking at current armed conflicts and the roles that emerging technologies are playing. And so in terms of useful, it's very clear that some of these technologies that we'll be talking about today are incredibly useful and potentially necessary for the ability to wage the next generation of warfare, to be ready as a country and with partners and allies for battlefield environments we'll be encountering. We've seen the significant role that unmanned systems of all sorts, not just unmanned aerial vehicles, but also, they're listening, but also submersibles, various other sorts of things are playing in the Ukraine conflict, for example. Now, these are autonomous systems, but they're not necessarily agentic in the way we're talking about today, in that they have to phone home or they're being guided. Well, it's become clear with the level of contestation of the electronic battlefield that we see today, that like jamming, counter jamming, this kind of thing, that in order to have the most capacity in these sorts of warfighting situations, it's really critical to move to having things which have a higher degree of autonomy. So that's a really valuable use case. In terms of weirdness, though, and I think these relate, there are a bunch of examples that I've come across as secondary. I used to be an engineer, but I'm not an engineer in my current work, so I'm not playing with these things on a daily granular level, but I'm reading a lot of secondary stories. And one example, guy's training an agent to play a video game. And he's thought he has the heuristic lined up correctly so that he's the reward function so that it gets points for certain things in order to get it to the finish line of this boat race and get the most points. And then he looks at what it's doing on the screen, and it's just going round and round and round in a little harbor. Why? Because it got points for going into that harbor. And it had figured out a hack to this game, and it didn't care about finishing. It was just getting as many points as possible. And so there are all sorts of examples of weird stuff that can happen when you think you've designed everything perfectly, given it good data to train on, and so on. And with agentic systems that sometimes might be using multiple models in combination, you really have to know what's in the sausage that you're putting together and what the potential risks are when you combine those things.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all today. So I'm for the first time in years outside of civilian, so it's going to feel great to be able to say my opinion without having it all been blessed by comms. So I think it'll be interesting to talk about agents with you all, because I think when I'm thinking about surprising, and I don't love the term agent and agentic, and I worry it grounds us too much in sort of thinking about it as sort of like some sort of mouse and keyboard automation type scenario, where it's usually much simpler. I mean, the most useful thing I've seen it, which I don't know how many folks in here write code, but I don't know a single person who writes code right now who is not forking over $20 or 40 or 100 every month to help them write code. It'd be like, I don't know, canceling your cable subscription to watch TV, or not subscribing to like your streaming services to watch TV. And it's pretty impressive how quickly it can spin up sites and also help you debug and also help you find issues and explain that information. And I think if folks don't code, you can do it now. I swear to God. You can make more than you ever thought. The strangest thing, I've been fortunate to be pretty hands-on with them, that I'm not terribly surprised by what I've seen. I've also been in Department of Homeland Security, where we're largely dealing with more secure government infrastructure, where I'm not, especially my academic colleagues, looking at the frontier of what's possible. I mean, a fun thing, actually the video game triggered me, is for the Pokemon fans in the room, they took a pretty standard model, Claude, and this is pretty famous now in the kind of like AI community, and they used an agent to have it see whether Claude could figure out how to escape from Mount Moon in one of the Pokemon, for those people who similar to me didn't have much of a childhood. And what's really interesting is you should try to find some of the conversations with the person who made it, because it's pretty good at figuring out kind of what to do in certain circumstances. But the problem with Mount Moon is it's really dark, and the models don't have that good of vision. And so they can't really see some of the little details on the map in as clear a way. And so it's interesting to hear how we kind of tried to balance that. But in terms of the actual actions, it sounds like it's pretty simple. You basically say, here are the 10 different things you can do. At each moment, determine which of these 10 things you're going to do next. Here's your overall goals, and you just keep asking it, do it, and do it, and do it, and have you escape Mount Moon. That was a cool one, and I think it's interesting for people to look up.
Similar to Michael, I think in terms of useful agent use cases, I think a very striking one from quite recent is Google released a coding agent called Alpha Evolve that was specifically designed to do algorithm discovery. And what was particularly useful about this is that while it sort of was able to kind of reach various sorts of like mathematical insights, mostly to do with like matrix multiplication, it already had the ability to sort of translate into direct real-world impact for Google. So it helped them have more efficient kernel optimization. So basically allowed it to speed up its time training, like the next generation of models, its Gemini models. It also allowed it to improve its data center scheduling, resulting in, I think the estimate was something like 0.7% global compute recovery. So pretty significant savings without very much cost on the part of Google. I think what's particularly sort of striking about this is one, sort of what it reveals about what agent use cases might look like. So I think people imagine, and the example that one of the other panelists gave is a good example of kind of what people think about when they hear agents. They think about like this sort of do anything agent, the personal assistant, the universal assistant. But my suspicion is that some of the most compelling use cases will be actually very specialized agents that sort of, instead of relying it on the systems to do things similar to a human, it will leverage sort of the unique strengths that an agent has. The ability to kind of search across like a mass like combinatorial space, and then sort of rapidly identify and then sort of verify which solutions within that space actually result in some sort of measurable improvement in some process that you're looking at. I think we'll see more of these kinds of agents. And in terms of kind of interesting, there are a series of studies that looked into the use of language model agents for sort of military or sort of like state-level decision-making in terms of like foreign policy. And I think a number of these studies found that for whatever reason, large language model agents tended to be much more escalatory or aggressive than sort of human equivalents. And I don't think they realized or kind of figured out why that is the case, but I think it is interesting when you're thinking about the future use of agents in sort of the military domain, national security space. I think you really do want to know why agents sort of behave the way they do, and why they might differ in terms of their behavior than a human operator that's placed in the same position.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, you think about the way a mouse works, where we have this CAPTCHA test. Humans are so slow at using a mouse that we can tell you're a human because you click too slowly. So there's no reason for the agents to follow our example. They'll find their own tools. If you do think of agents as humans, which is a bit anthropomorphic, it's never going to be precise, what kind of level of autonomy do they have now, right? Are they like a typical human 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 20-year-old? You take some of the best general agents, kind of what age level is their responsibility or their ability to get tasks done sitting at right now? How far would you trust them?
Would you like me to start, Jason? Sure. So I've taken a look at a lot of these benchmarks, and I'll say one thing about this kind of overall framing of like how well is an agent compared to like a human. Again, for the reasons sort of I mentioned earlier, it's a useful framing because it kind of tells you like how close am I to getting my job replaced or something. But in some ways, it's not very useful because I think the kind of sharp capabilities of agents, the ones that will kind of get you maybe the most value or have the most transformative impact, will be things that, a human, that don't require like a full suite of sort of like human capabilities to do that. I think the AlphaEvolve is a great example of that. So maybe it's a bit useful to talk about specific areas, and then cybersecurity is something I'm familiar with. So if you're looking at various kinds of cybersecurity benchmarks, I think you'll find that, and if you look at like UKAC reports on this, roughly the current state-of-the-art models perform at something like a non-technical expert, generally, on the specific test task in which it's evaluated. Agents also maybe roughly can perform some tasks that like a cyber apprentice could perform. But in a lot of ways, this doesn't really capture, because even though they can perform at this level, they can accomplish tasks that this equivalent human can perform. Do they do so very reliably? They don't do so very reliably. I think we're still very far from the world where you can kind of drop in an agent to replace like a cyber security intern or something, which kind of shows you the difference between how agents perform in like tests and the levels of reliability and proficiency that will be needed for them to actually perform in the real world. So I think you'll see more kind of sharp applications of agents and less, total substitutes of specific humans for agents in the near term.
Can I ask you a question too?
Of course, yeah.
Folks, I'm always curious to sort of see who's in the room on these things. So how many folks in the month of May think that they've used an AI agent at some point during the month of May? And how many folks have used ChatGPT or something similar in this month? Yeah, okay. I think that's a helpful context. I mean, I'm sort of curious what you all have seen, if you all have been using it. To me, I guess I just see it on a different dimension, which is, I mean, just, what was it, yesterday, 2 days ago, OpenAI announced they're starting to release their sort of newest coding agent, and to kind of compare it to a human, I have no moral objection to anthropomorphizing AI. I'm not sure why it's something I have to worry about particularly, but I just don't think it's a helpful analogy in this particular case, because it seems like the pattern that OpenAI is more and more moving to is not, oh, you have this thing run and you're kind of sitting there in the co-pilot style looking at what it's doing. It's actually, you give it 10 different tasks, you go and you do your task, and then you come back to it however long later, and you see, okay, how well did this work? Anyone who's used it for research, which now when I have a research project where I'm going to sit there for 15 to 30 minutes clicking on websites, I'm always kicking off one of the research agents just to see what it comes up with at the same time. And I've asked it everything from helping me figure out something with my taxes to looking up some minor medical thing that my partner had. Obviously, with the caveat that I told her also to talk to a doctor, but just as a first pass. And so, I think to me, but that kind of, that's on a very different spectrum because it's happening so quickly. I think that's the point, is that I guess when we're talking to folks who are thinking about how to write policy about this, if we're only looking at it from, I guess what I worry about is we're only looking at this from the lens of, does this replace jobs or not? Does this replace me or not? And I think you're just going to miss a huge part of the conversation if that's sort of the approach that we're taking. And so anyway, I'm also very curious to hear what you all think of where these things are at. For me, it's hard to give it an age. Maybe it's like 1,000 years old, because I could never read 10,000 documents in 30 seconds and summarize it pretty well.
Yeah. So it's rough. It captures some parts, but not others.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it might replace tasks without replacing entire jobs, at least at first.
That's right. Or change the way that we think about approaching those tasks.
Yeah, I think the main thing for me with trying to give it an age is the lack of fungibility between capabilities, that it mirrors human. like, you might see it do something like its use of language, or its ability to code, or its ability to do research, or to read, and you might think, wow, you'd have to be like brilliant and 25 to do that. And then another thing you might give it, it's going to fall off a cliff, because if you come at it from an anthropomorphizing place, you might think of things that are parallel, they develop at the same time in a human brain, but actually are very different types of tasks, or similar tasks but over very different types of information. And you just won't see the same behavior level at those different tasks. They don't develop at the same rate in these agents. And so I think it could be misleading. It could lead to false assumptions. I mean, even take, for example, interacting with a chatbot about some topic where it's using ChatGPT, for example, or something else that you're, you think, well, its linguistic capability is so sophisticated. And so I expect that its reasoning capability will be equally sophisticated. There's sort of a baked-in assumption when you're interacting with a human being that that would be the case. And you can't assume that, depending on the topic in particular.
Yeah, no, makes sense. No reason for AI development to exactly recapitulate human development.
Yeah, I'm also really against anthropomorphizing AI agents, but I think we need to understand AI agents on their own terms in the same way that we need to understand artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence in their own ways. The reason is that these words are just really engraved into the public imagination, and if you just ignore the words, we can't really have constructive conversations around the development of these systems with very powerful actors out there who are building systems that they call AI agents or AGI. So I want to share kind of like a summary of a paper that I recently did with a colleague of mine at Google DeepMind. And this paper, we wanted to characterize the notion of AI agents for the purposes of AI policy and governance. So we did this characterization from two perspectives. One, we wanted to really understand, is AI agent a thing of the 2025, or did we have AI agents before? The second was that we figured there's so many different companies that now are calling themselves companies building agentic AI products. So when we look at them, we just say, look, this is a ChatGPT, this is a chatbot, but they're now calling it AI agents. And so what does it mean for a product to be really AI agents? So we find two kind of like, I think, hopefully like insightful lessons from looking at the whole literature. First of all, since 1977, computer scientists have building AI agents. So the first standard textbook in the United States on artificial intelligence, Introduction to AI, written by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, has on its cover a guide to building AI agents in 1995, 31 years ago. So at those years, people were building things that, according to the standards of the day, they would call AI agents, but we don't call them AI agents, right? So that's one thing that I think really helps just to figure out, well, AI agents has always been the goal of artificial intelligence research and development. We want to automate some tasks, means that we're going to have some systems that are going to do things on our behalf, okay? The second thing is that I think we really should avoid buying into this kind of like tendency of thinking about a product being agentic or not. So agenticness of AI systems are not binary. And when we reviewed a lot of research and also a lot of like product descriptions, we figured that maybe the most useful way to think about the agenticness of AI system is gonna depend on 4 different dimensions or axes. And each of these axes, we need to think about them in grades in relation to like different gradations. So what does it mean? It means that an AI system could be more agentic or less agentic. It's not that an AI system is an agent or not. So one of these dimensions is the dimension of autonomy, which means the capacity of a system to to kind of like act without external control. And you can think about Waymo, right? Like self-driving cars. There are examples of AI agents that we've had since years ago. They can act without like driver control. The second kind of dimension is a notion of environmental efficacy. So how much a specific system can impact the environment. A lot of the current systems that are called generative agentic AI, they are functioning within a simulation environment. So what does it mean? It means that they're in some sandbox environments and they do some things, they don't impact at all things out there in the world. But if you think about the use of these systems in lethal autonomous weapons or Waymo or other systems, you can see that they can have very immediate causal impact. So agenticness, we should think about it across dimension, from the dimension of efficacy as well. The second one is the complexity of the goal. So sometimes you can have these systems that can probably do long-term planning and replace a very complex worker, digital worker or something. As previously mentioned, we are just not at all close to having those AI systems or AI agents, but some systems can do very specialized acts for very special, well-scoped purposes, less goal complexity. I think we are having those kinds of systems. And then I think the last dimension of agenticness is the notion of generality. So with the first example that I gave, the Astra as a universal AI assistant, this is an example of an agent that can perform a variety of functions across a variety of roles. But with most of the meaningful systems we have, for example, in the science domain, AI scientists, AI co-scientists, they are very specialized agents that are working, again, performing a specific kind of task. So yeah, if we want to think about AI agents, that I think we have to, because this term is all around us, maybe the most useful way to do is just to think about agenticness across one of these dimensions and think about the policy or governance implications in relation to these dimensions.
Thank you. So it seems like we have a consensus that agents can do some amazing things, but that most of those things get done right now unreliably and with some need for human input. So let's talk about that human input. What does supervision of AI agents look like? How do we evaluate agents? How often should we be evaluating them? Who should be evaluating them? What should they be looking for? Does it matter what field the agent is working in terms of who evaluates it and when and how? I might start off with Michael and then go around.
Sure, and so I'm very interested to hear my panelists' own perspective on this, because where I come from is the world of sort of enterprise technology in a big organization and the limits of a technology environment in which you have sort of a lot of rules and a lot of concerns, sensitive data, potential security considerations. And so I think for me, what I think about in terms of how we should be evaluating it, and what's really interesting about these tools, especially for those folks who've used it, and I just love I'm just going back here, because I love the point of, we could go back, probably my Honda Accord, you could call an AI agent because it has that lane assist feature, which keeps me in the middle of my lane. And so, you could go back to the 1990s, and probably earlier, where people are imagining these kind of multi-step, there's some sort of decision-making process. And so more and more, as we think about how this works, we're just talking about software. And my background, in addition to the AI core, is in teams like the U.S. Digital Service and other places where we think a lot about how to make software in an enterprise context. And I think what's interesting about AI is that there's a whole bunch of evaluation frameworks. We get into situations where you want more or less human oversight. I think what I would posit to many folks in this room, though, is when we were working through some of these AI applications, some of the things in making good software was really important, just as much as these robust quantitative evaluation frameworks. The thing that jumps into my mind is having good design researchers who, when you release a new agent, are sitting there and collecting user feedback from the actual users who are using that agent. Because we'd make these lists of evaluations, and we'd run those lists of evaluations through, and we'd come up with metrics on how well it's performing, and then inevitably we would release some AI tool and actually talk to a person who's actually using it, and 2 or 3 of those use cases were not what we expected when we actually pushed it out. And this is not something that's new. This has happened since the dawn of software. You could, model it in sort of a ivory tower environment, but what you should actually be trying to do is have quick iteration and feedback cycles. And I actually think, I think the Hill loves talking about, at least in the text I've seen, evaluation and AI impact assessments. But my own background of these kind of lean and more agile styles of software delivery, that is a heavily waterfall way of approaching it. And what you risk is reproducing, as we get into this AI world, all of the mistakes we made with heavily waterfall software for the last 3 or 4 decades in the US. and thinking about how to actually incentivize deploying these things more quickly, learning quickly, and then adapting them, not just through metrics, but also through user research and seeing how people are actually interacting with the software, I think is a really important thing that we need to think about. And I don't hear enough folks talking about it because of the sort of academic underpinnings, I think, of a lot of the recent AI progress that we've seen, which is a very scientific way of sort of looking at it. So anyway, that's sort of my sort of broad message I would say there. Of course, I'm sure my colleagues will get into great detail on some of the other pieces I'm interested in.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. In a lot of ways, I have a lot of sympathy for that perspective. I will maybe make a sort of exception for, I think there is still a role for developers and then ideally working with the government to sort of test some of these agents and their underlying foundation models for sort of what I would term as national security relevant capabilities. But I think there was also a very important need to be able to sort of quickly deploy agents and sort of iterate and improve on that basis. I think the question here is who is empowered to evaluate these agents? And I think that's where the question of what is the actual agent infrastructure that is in place becomes really important. A user can really only evaluate the actions of an agent. Imagine you and an agent work for, let's say, in the future world where agents are actually capable of handling month-long tasks, you leave an agent for, a month or so to handle a bunch of tasks. It's going to take, they operate much more quickly than humans. They're going to take, potentially thousands and thousands of tasks. You might have a team of agents, going off and doing a whole bunch of things. How are you going to actually assess what it's done? How do you know when it's made a mistake or not? You need the infrastructure in place to even give you that visibility and allow you to sort of be empowered to make decisions on that behalf. So I think we should look for, service providers, the AI companies, and government to start building some of that infrastructure in place so that we can actually, have visibility and be able to actually make meaningful sort of oversight of the agents we choose to deploy.
Well, I'm going to take a quick step back and just say, which I forgot at the beginning, that since I am a DoD employee, this is my own views. Everyone knows that, but something somebody said reminded me of that. I'm an academic, so a little absent-minded. So I think that there are a few things here that are important to think about when thinking about when and how frequently these should be evaluated and by whom. Partly it has to do with how we think about risk and what the different risks and risk profiles of different use cases are and what use cases we might see with a particular product. There, of course, are catastrophic risks, as we started out by talking about, where we think of loss of life, destruction, lethality, and I started out with example of battlefield uses. Obviously, there are risks associated with our laws of armed conflict and ethics there, and there also are risks associated with things that maybe don't rise to the level of catastrophic, but that are nonetheless socially or economically catastrophic. You think of financial flash crash events taken to a new magnitude. Think of what can happen. I started out my career in I'm a political scientist studying the ways in which authoritarian and hybrid regimes were trying to control the internet by censorship and other techniques. And the other techniques became very interesting because it became clear some countries were reticent to overtly censor and instead were trying to manipulate the information environment in ways that were more subtle and less visible, and finding that worked just as well or better for their purposes. But that was in early days before we had these sorts of capabilities we're talking about. What does it do to our information environment? You asked me to, when we get to the next level with bots talking to bots, producing content, interacting, and humans don't necessarily know which they're interacting with. They don't know whether the content they're looking at was produced by a human or even vetted by a human. So there are all sorts of lesser catastrophes that don't rise to the level of some sort of massive event involving critical infrastructure protection or a massive event involving battlefield escalation. Depending on the types of risks we're looking at, we might have different levels of need to check in more frequently. But I agree with what one of the other panelists said. It has to be iterative. And I also think that it's really important there be as much relevant transparency as possible in contexts where that could potentially ameliorate risks. And those won't necessarily be totally obvious, but some of these agentic uses will involve multiple models, for example, interacting. Well, for the average user, that might be a black box where they don't know what's under the hood at all, whereas the person who designed it, parts of it might still be a black box, but not all of it. They understand what systems are interacting with which systems or which models. Maybe there are situations in which a doctor using a system like that to help with decision-making should actually know what the interacting parts of the agent are so that they have a better sense of the risk profile. As these things get more complicated, one of the things we need to worry about is supply chain and the risks that might get baked in all the way up the supply chain from things which you're no longer thinking about as the cutting edge. I think about the example from a few years ago now where there was a model that one of the leading tech companies was using for facial recognition that was based on, I believe, an open source data set, and that was extremely biased in its identification of certain faces based on race. And they didn't know that that was in there. They didn't. They had used available public source images, and those images were from newspapers, and they overrepresented some races than others, and it made the algorithm really bad at identifying some. And this was then being used as part of an open source library that was being called by all sorts of higher functionalities. And nobody was thinking about that open source functionality that they were calling. It was just baked in all the way up. Well, what further things, especially when we're getting into things that are robotic, which involve the Internet of Things or critical infrastructure and moving parts, potential for physical damage, what other possibilities are there with those sorts of things being built in all the way up that aren't on our radar, are unknown risks? And so having as much transparency with users at different relevant points would be as possible, would be important to helping to identify those, I believe.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the vertically integrated supply chain, because one of the questions I wanted to ask, and we actually lost a panelist over this, we were going to ask about market concentration, and one of the big tech companies dropped out when they saw that question. So maybe Atoosa, you can get us started on this one. How do you think AI agents are going to affect market concentration? Is there an advantage here for small startups? Is there an advantage for large companies? Why?
I guess I kind of want to first start by reiterating what I said before, that we've had examples of market and power concentration over the past couple of decades, right? And so these AI agents are an extension of the systems that we've had before, and they're going to function in an ecosystem that we already have in place, right? So in some sense, from one angle, actually, it seems well, we've had these market power concentrations for a variety of different software algorithmic tools, and these are kind of an extension. The current generative AI agents are very clearly an extension of generative AI models functioning in the same environment. Therefore, we're going to see some of the the dynamics around them as well. But I think there's one very interesting question around what kinds of beneficial AI systems can open source companies or non-big tech companies develop and put in the service for people who really want to automate specific types of systems. I had a colleague who was working in the UK, and they're trying to develop very, very simple agentic AI systems that are helping some immigrants and refugees in refugee camps, right? It's a very specific, beneficial use case of very simple agentic AI system development. One of the specific use cases is they're developing the systems that can help translation of the different sayings between different people. And so I guess in that sense, maybe there's an interesting opportunity to kind of leverage the power of the systems for benefiting, for the benefit of a specific community, like minority communities, variety of different cases, variety of different places.
Yeah, we might be able to get some things done that couldn't be done at all or couldn't be done practically beforehand. So that could be startups of a kind. Anyone else have thoughts on market concentration on the panel?
I think you can think of market concentration in sort of two dimensions. One is on the part of who's providing the AI agents and the surrounding infrastructure. So I would imagine that, for the same reasons that training and developing the sort of like foundation models themselves is extremely capital intensive, it will favor incumbents. Others seem to think that to the extent that agents are kind of an application layer, like product, there's a lot more sort of like greenfield there. Y Combinator, I think, in its like latest slate of like kind of public priorities for sort of new kinds of startups to invest in, suggested that like agentic applications is this sort of, they're looking for a lot of ideas in this area. So, to the extent that you can kind of treat them as a sort of signal of where things are going. I think the really interesting question is more on the who is going to be using these agents as they're being developed. And I think you can expect a kind of digital divide there. My colleagues and I have been working on sort of thinking of ways to promote the sort of defensive use of agents in a cybersecurity context. So you can imagine that as agents become more capable in terms of vulnerability discovery and helping sort of human teams patch possible vulnerabilities, zero-day vulnerabilities, certain kinds of actors are going to just be much more well set up than others. Those that are more tech literate, those that have more highly capable workforce in these specific areas are going to be much more capable than others when using these systems in beneficial ways. If you look at just sort of historically, you'll often see that with any new sort of tech, you'll see like superstar firms that operate at much higher levels of productivity, and you'll have a lot of like mid-tier and low-tier firms that aren't able to just pick up and leverage technology, any new technology, in any significant way. There's a big lag. And why I worry about this in a societal context is that you can imagine that when you need some very important stakeholders, for instance, critical national infrastructure providers, to be using the best possible tools available so that they can secure systems that are of importance to not just the employees of a specific company, but for the entire country, you're going to want more capable, more tech literate people. So I think we have to start thinking about ways to sort of bridge that digital divide, whether it's from the government, whether it's from civil society, to kind of equip the people that need to use these tools the most. And we can't, and not just let things sort of play out as they might without that sort of intervention.
Yeah, if you need a best-in-class cybersecurity system just to stay online, then that's bad news for the water treatment plant. They're not going to get there all on their own all across the country.
I think that there's two pieces I'd highlight that coincide with some of what was just said. I'm concerned that there's the possibility of cost prohibitiveness for smaller market entrants, for smaller companies. I remember 5 or 6 years ago, I was involved in a transatlantic working group on disinformation. And we were meeting with folks from government, folks from academia, folks from the private sector, the group involved folks from those. And we were talking to people, in particular from some of the platform companies, different size platforms. And it was really noteworthy, the difference in how difficult it was for the smaller platforms to deal with what was seen as a bit of a crisis at that point, figuring out how to get out in front of some of the malicious or inadvertent uses of their platforms to spread mis and disinformation or extremism, and how to deal with that, how to address that. And companies that had fewer employees and less manpower to throw at the problem were really facing fork in the road sorts of decisions, poorly chosen, and were really challenged by that in a way that larger companies were not. So I think that there's a need to think about how to prevent worst-case risks, as we just talked about, with agentic technologies. And at the same time, that adds potentially regulatory burden or other sorts of burdens on top of the cost prohibitiveness of foundation model development to begin with, or of access to some models and data. And so how do you square that so that you, on the one hand, deal with enough of the risks, mitigate enough of the risks in a way that prevents them from getting out of hand in some catastrophic way, which will lead to a much higher regulatory burden afterwards? Or at the same time, making sure there's enough oversight, enough consideration of risks at all of those granular levels while pushing it out, because these things have the potential to be used in so many different sectors of society and across digital divides if made maximally available and used in places where they can favor and benefit more local communities, sectors of the economy that aren't the center of attention of the tech sector. But for that, there needs to be some consideration of how to balance the risks at that more granular level of use.
Very interesting. Thank you. You don't have to if you don't have.
I mean, I'll take the next. I'll take the next one.
Yeah, let's see. I think you'll like the next one. So I know the reconciliation bill is moving around, so that may be on people's minds. Maybe you came here to get away from it. I don't know. But what should the federal government be buying? Right? What are the procurement standards for AI agents? Are they adequate? If so, what do you like about them? And if not, what's missing?
Truly, now that I'm out, I really get to answer this question honestly, which was, one of my favorite things as a largely career civil servant was when I was working with politicals who had landed, this is for my, the staffers in the room who might jump over at some point. And it was almost like clockwork that when we had some new initiative that they wanted to push, the political who'd been on for 4 weeks or whatever would say, I think that there's some interesting procurement things we could do here to really move this along faster. And there was never any specificity to what the interesting procurement things were or how it would approach, but they knew that it was a good idea. And so I think what we saw, at least when we talk about federal procurement and those sort of processes, and again, my colleagues will talk about sort of as it relates to the outward and how it affects the markets, but there are, and I think there's a lot of people who have written a lot, and I think this is a space to get into the weeds about, but you're always going to have a fundamental challenge when you're trying to make procurement better, because on one hand, you want to do it quickly and you want to buy the best thing, and on the other hand, you don't want to lead to a situation where there's no controls, where people just give money to their friends. And you're always going to have that balance, and that balance is always going to be there. And so then there comes the question of procuring AI, which that's a very interesting thing. So, when I think about at Department of Homeland Security, we launched the largest generative AI chatbot in the department, DHS Chat. And while we were transparent, we put it on our AI use case inventory, we follow all the rules there. If you were to look at our procurement records, you would not find DHS Chat in any RFP. You would not find DHS Chat in any sort of contracting vehicle. You would have found it in two places. You would have found it in the cloud, the broad cloud package that we bought that included certain cloud services that gave us access to the models that came in and approved. And in my case, I had a largely federal team, so you would find it in the feds who were working on it. But we never bought DHS Chat or put out a thing for DHS Chat that you could sort of trace it to. We were, of course, transparent afterwards. And I think that's what I'm seeing across most agencies right now when it comes to AI. When you think about buying an agent, I don't think it's likely you'll see many people being like, I want an agent that does this hyper-specific thing as a tool. What is more likely is you'll see them doing it as a service contract. So they will put out the service contract where they want, name your big contracting or small contracting firm to basically provide FTEs to them to build a thing, and then they will marry it up with whatever platforms or tools that they already have on hand in their department that are already approved. I'm not seeing as much of, for an agent or like a workflow specific thing, people buying specific workflows, although you may see with some of the really, really big, like your Geminis or your ChatGPTs, you may see once they get their act in order, some of those like broader productivity tools being bought, but it's really at that service level and then at the broader platforms that underpin the technology that folks are developing on is where at least I saw it, and where you should be trying to target procurement as you're thinking about the reforms that you're trying to make there. But it'll also make it hard. I'm sorry. It'll also make it hard for you to target it, because what you'd love to be able to say is, when you're buying an AI agent, and I guess what I'm trying to tell you is, that doesn't, in my experience, it doesn't really happen. It's like not something I see happening very often. And so there's probably other better policy levers in sort of how to kind of control that. And if you're trying to incentivize it, you should incentivize it at that kind of cloud layer or at the service contract, or just letting people hire feds perspective.
Interesting. Anyone else on that one? If not, I'll throw it open to the audience for questions. Yeah, in the front.
So first off, you use Project Astra? How cool. The glasses?
No.
Darn, okay. Well, I'm very eager about that. And I of course watched the announcement today. So I was going to ask the panel, we were talking earlier about the various deep research products available. Claude has one now for Anthropic. Google has one through Gemini, and ChatGPT, of course, OpenAI has one. Which one thinks best? Like, which one? Yeah, if you had to rely on one, as your daily driver, what would you pick?
The one that I already have paid my subscription fee to.
If I paid for the top tier service for each of those three things, because God help me, I am. What three can I use to add some cash into my pocket too?
Look for stock tips. I haven't used the Claude or Gemini ones. The one I've used is the Chat. I've looked. There's some other smaller ones from some other startup companies that I've tried that, played around with, and they were all right too. But for my basic purpose, which is to avoid me spending 10 minutes clicking around the internet, the one I'm already paying for has been sufficient for me.
I guess that requires us to have used the multiple different kinds of systems. And also it really depends on what type of research you run. So I've used ChatGPT for OO's deep research. And for the specific types of questions I ask, I was satisfied. But I haven't used Claude's deep research or Gemini's deep research, so I'm not able to answer two questions.
I have used Claude, Gemini, and ChatGPT's deep research functions. Luckily, my organization has a sort of flexible AI subscription policy. I will say that the performance is largely comparable, and the issue is that an answer I give today is not going to be like, what's the best model in a few months? I mean, there isn't a clear kind of lead at the moment, and I think that says something about, I don't know, like how tight maybe like the so-called race is between the labs in creating a product that stands apart.
Yeah, in the green tie.
So I have kind of two questions. One of them is very specific in regards to what you said and mentioning kind of going back and forth and having a transparency in what we're talking about. How is that possible without some degree of open source nature for these code bases and for these AI systems? And then a general question to the whole panel. It seems to me that AI agents largely are successful when they're in a closed environment, especially a digital environment where there's not random things that can happen. Until we kind of get through that barrier where we're able to interpret information in a way that is very general and broad, it seems like it's not going to be applicable to this kind of broad scale world where things can happen in the real world that can't happen in a digital sphere. And I just want to know whether you agree with that.
Okay, let's get your follow-up on the transparency, and then maybe have someone else from the panel with an opinion about sandboxes.
Sure. So on the transparency, to some extent, yes, I agree. I mean, there are issues and complexities around open source versus closed, and I think it probably depends on the specifics. But I was channeling a discussion I remember from a few months ago with colleagues at NDU where we were talking about more about things like ChatGPT and large language models, not so much agentic AI necessarily, but one of my colleagues had said, well, the problem is you don't know what goes into this, because not just because it's black box because of the type of AI, but also because of the proprietary nature. And you don't know what sort of other rules have been put into it or what. And I think for agentic systems, that's doubly the case, or many times the case. And so I think there needs to be a conversation about what sorts of transparency and to whom are necessary or important to avert certain types of risk. That could be about what sort of data things were trained on. That could be about safety testing, or it could be about the nature of the models that are used in combination themselves. And that might depend on the particular use case, expected use cases for that product, and what the respective risks are. A colleague who works at the State Department, maybe somebody here knows more about this than I do, was talking to me the other day and said, well, you work on emerging tech and AI. What do you think of the fact that I have a colleague who now writes all their memos using our in-house chat bot and AI system, and we and all the talking points. And my reaction was, well, there are things I would need to know in order to know whether that was appropriate. What data, like what texts was this trained on? Was it things that went back 30 years? Or was it talking points and memos from the specific, was it accessing a specific folder that had the current talking points on a subject and using those in combination with the larger training of the language capability? There are all sorts of different possibilities there that could have real consequences for whether they were even getting things that closely resembled the current political context. One. Two, what sort of reasoning is built into this AI capability that they're using? Is it just predictive text generation, or does it have some sort of specific reasoning capabilities vetted for the types of risk balancing challenges that they were particularly working on, or that other offices could be working on? And some of this transparency would go into that. You'd need to know a little bit more about the type of model you're working with or models you're working with in order to know whether it was appropriate to use it for certain purposes or not.
Can I jump? I mean, I think it's sort of interesting here because it's also interesting hearing my colleague from National Defense University, because again, my brain is on the sort of the mundane and DHS AI Corps is really focused on internal mission support help. We were not dealing with our most high criticality use cases like you might, maybe in a DoD context. I know DoD has done some pretty impressive stuff with how they've leveraged AI. But for what we were doing, which at least in our generative AI space was far more focused on basic productivity, when I think about transparency and I also think about usefulness, again, now that I'm out, I get to say this to be just a little controversy to have people, we're 45 minutes in or whatever, to raise their eyebrows. I'm not particularly that interested in, if I knew all the data that went in it, I'm actually not necessarily sure it would help me that much. Because now, if there's really wild data that went in it, maybe, but again, the generative AI models, your ChatGPT, your 4.0s, your ChatGPT models, they're trained on a bunch of things, and then they have humans do this RLHF process in which they're basically providing it feedback to get it to change its behavior over time. And so you could try to look at the underlying training data, but it's going to go through some number of transformations that I probably don't even know the number of. And I think GPT-2 had 34 stacked transformer layers on top of it with like a 1,000 context window. I mean, that's certainly in the many, millions of trillions of transformations that those numbers are going through. So if I said, oh, this data was changed, many trillions and trillions of times, therefore I kind of know what's going to happen, I don't know if I can extrapolate that or tell you it. So when we talk about transparency, going back to my design and just looking at how people are using it, I am much more interested in the outcome side of it than knowing kind of necessarily what went in it, unless there's something particularly egregious. but is, well, use it. Tell me what's going to happen here, and that's more useful information to me, and it's much more tangible. I would actually tell my staff, and I believe this, unless you were truly doing a creative writing assignment, if you were doing work-a-day writing, I don't think anybody in the professional world for work-a-day writing should submit a piece of long-form writing to their boss without, unless it's sensitive, of course, without putting it into an AI system and asking it to do a quick copy and spot check for succinctness and for clarity, and just give some recommendations of how you can improve that writing before sending it to your boss. Just as you would click on your spell check before you submitted it, I think you should at least do that, review it, and then determine whether you like any of the recommendations. And so I do think we should have a more aggressive use. But the last thing, sorry, I'm totally rambling here, but on the transparency, I think it's a great question. With these agents, I actually think we can get to a world where we can leverage open source without necessarily having to convince OpenAI to give us the training data for their models. We know that there's a model, and most of the agent layer is just, it depends, but again, I'm thinking about these work-a-day situations are, here's the 5 things you get to do. You get to give me text output, you get to ask me to go to a website, you get to ask me to pull the information from a website, you get to read the information from a website and put it into your knowledge store, and you get to basically generate information. You get to tell me which order you'd like to do these, and then tell me when you're done. And that code is pretty transparent and is what underpins a lot of these agents. If we were to open source it, you could just see, like, here are the different tools that they're calling, here are different situations. The part that you wouldn't see would be that underlying, all those model weights maybe. But I think you could get a decent sense in a nice open source environment of how the agent is set up, how it's intended to work. And obviously there's transparency on the how is it evaluated side too that you could need. But I don't think that these two need to be in tension, and I actually think you could be quite transparent about how you're setting up an agent, even if you can't get that underlying brain is totally transparent. And again, what I'm trying to say is, I don't think you'll be able to convince OpenAI to give you their secret sauce, which is the data they put into it, but B, I'm not really sure if you had that, unless you did something truly egregious, it would really change that much in how you would act.
Definitely a framing worth considering in terms of what does transparency mean. I want to quickly hear from Atoosa about the sandbox question, like, can these agents perform outside a sandbox, or how do we get there? Take one question from the back, and then we'll wrap.
So what was the question?
Do you want to repeat the sandbox question?
Yeah, just, it seems like that most agents
Oh,
are
right, yeah.
successful
Okay,
in
yeah.
digital space.
No, this is actually quite interesting. So I want to refer to a very, very interesting paper that came out from Carnegie Mellon University a couple of days ago. I think you would really enjoy reading it. It's called The Agent Company. So this is an example where actually the researchers, a very large group of researchers, wanted to see whether these systems, these AI agents in sandbox perform so well, because we think that, oh, maybe actually in the sandbox environment they would perform well. And so what they did is that they provided a very interesting, like, simple company, and then each of the employees in this simulated company resembled like a simple employee in the real world, so digital workers in the sandbox environment. And then they had a benchmark. The AI agent company is a benchmark. And they wanted to figure whether actually in this very simple digital environment, this AI agent's performance is so well. And they figured that even in that simple environment, the performance of the digital workers is extremely low, like 24%, for example, on average. And so this is an example which basically shows that even in the sandbox environments, AI agents can't really perform some of the tasks that we think they might perform super well. But then, there are a couple of people who are trying to figure whether in simulated environments, like if you have like game environments, the systems show emergent behavior, right? Another very interesting paper came out from Stanford University. Title of the paper is called Generative Agent. And this example shows a couple of different, you put a couple of different agents in a game environment, and then they are plugged or connected to some language models, and then they learn somehow, like through evolutionary games, how they have to specifically perform, what they should do, whether they should write a letter, things like that. So I think this is really an experimental space, and I don't think we have like conclusive evidence that the systems work well in the simulated environments.
Thank you. All right, question from the back half of the room, maybe? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, so I know you guys touched up a little bit earlier on catastrophic risks, and a lot of safety experts have been talking about this for quite some time, but I find it interesting that this doesn't seem to be an issue that's permeated in mainstream a lot, despite the fact that a lot of people have been talking that this could be really, really bad and threaten not only some national security, the future of warfare, but possibly all of humanity. So I wanted to ask you guys what you are most worried about for the future of AI, and if you were to communicate one thing to a representative's office, what you would like for policy for them to push.
Any volunteers?
Yeah, I've thought about this very specific question. So, I look at a couple of different like soft regulator proposals that some companies are using in order to mitigate catastrophic risk from artificial intelligence systems. And one of my very interesting findings with just reading through these documents is that what is a catastrophic risk depends on who defines it and depends on what are the things at stake, right? So if you ask from some people who have huge profits, connected to the development of AI system, the threshold for what is called a catastrophic event is going to go quite high. And so I think, there's a question of what is a catastrophic risk from AI? It's not really clear what it is. But I think it's quite important to think about catastrophic or existential risk from AI systems. But unfortunately, and I really think this is very unfortunate that, again, in the public imagination, we have this binary between immediate risk of harm that are not catastrophic and existential risk or catastrophic harms, and those are serious stuff. But I'm a system engineer, and in system engineering 101, the first thing that you learn is that systems evolve, and typically what happens is that some accumulation of various different risks that you won't call them catastrophic through time and through various different relations would give rise to catastrophic events. So I think my personal recommendation is just really trying to look at the relationships between different types of risk from this system thinking kind of perspective. And I guess if we're gonna have a catastrophic event, it by definition is gonna happen through this systemic evolution, because these AI systems are incorporated into a global complex system, and that we just cannot ignore.
I think where there can be a disconnect between maybe what the public or your average lawmaker perceives in terms of thinking about AI in those terms, in terms of very severe risks, is that you're looking at, let's say, an agent today that can't handle a standard kind of browser task, or is quite unreliable, and then you're trying to connect that to what an agent could become. And kind of drawing that line is something that I think requires a lot of art and requires a kind of articulation of, what should the priorities actually be. What I would point them to is sort of the kind of various projections that various experts have made around kind of the ability of agents, projecting that agents will receive kind of high performance thresholds in things like machine learning engineering, cybersecurity performance, software engineering, high performance thresholds meaning 90% plus scores on some of these kind of gold standard benchmarks that we currently have by, somewhere between 2026 to close to 2030. You have the sort of report that Jason alluded to earlier, which was that you have a task length doubling time for some of these agents based on historical data of every 7 months, and more recently every 4 months. The task length that they're able to complete for software engineering tasks has sort of doubled, more and more rapidly. I would also sort of point to the importance of visibility. I think change can be very scary, and then when you're talking about systems whose capabilities are changing so fast, I think the priority has to be on making sure that the government and other actors know how these systems are sort of emerging before we even think about, what to do about it. I would also sort of, in addition to kind of visibility, investments in sort of capability evaluations, red teaming, security testing for these emerging models, to also include more sort of research and development activity, both from the government, which has historically had such an important role in sort of funding basic research, especially for sort of security, national security and sort of safety purposes, into the kind of tools that we might expect we might need if these systems continue to progress in the ways that they have.
So we're both dealing with catastrophic and then also a practical recommendation that you could give to a member or a staffer. And I think if you know, a thing I think the thing for staffers to consider here, of course, is, you know, there's a pressure when you're running policy to kind of come up with the answer. Like, what is the answer to this question? How do we do the right thing to prevent the catastrophic harm while spurring innovation? And I think what I would offer from the sort of the philosophies of the work that I've done in the past is, it's also about what are the steps you can take to get to an environment where there's the right information loops. And I think what we can all agree on is that today, a system like ChatGPT probably does not pose catastrophic harm to the world. Maybe it could in the future. Maybe it poses some other specific harms that people are concerned about. But what I am concerned about, coming from my background of being inside of the government, is that there are, you know, today I think maybe 2/3, 3/4 of the folks had raised their hand that they've used ChatGPT in the last month. If I were to do that same thing in an internal federal agency, my hunches would probably be between 1/3 and 1/2. And then if I asked them how many of those people have used it for work, for the important work that they do, it would be even lower. And so you have critical parts of our government where people are not actually thinking about how even these not very risky systems can be applied to the work that they're doing, where they have an information advantage on some really critical processes. So I think a solution that I would offer is this. I'm trying to sound as lawy as I can, that every CFO Act CIO has to certify in 6 months to the director of OMB that every, you know, GS7 and above employee who works at a desk has access to at least one, you know, generative AI system that they can use for non-classified information processing for work. Or they could submit an exception to the director if they have specific compelling reasons why they can't do that. Because just as I think you would want people to reason reasonably about how the internet works and how to use Excel and how to use Microsoft Word, it's wild to think that the government will be able to come up with good recommendations to keep us safe from this if most federal government employees are not even allowed to use generative AI systems in their day-to-day work. And I would strongly encourage, frankly, pushing on agencies to stop blocking them left and right, and actually there are plenty of, I mean, State Department has done an incredible job, DHS has made huge strides, but some of the other agencies that have the infrastructure, they do, and if not, create some exception process, can also set these systems up so that people can start to actually use it for work and start to think about what are the implications. And I think that's really critical to creating a good information environment where people are able to actually reason about, okay, what are the actual threats, and be able to start providing that feedback on, okay, how is this advancing and how will this impact the specific areas that I'm an expert in.
So 2 parts. First, I'll say I don't have a soundbitey, this is the policy you should put in place now, but I agree that we need to think about catastrophic risks, but we need to think, we end where we started. We need to think about things that go beyond what we immediately think of as catastrophic risks as well. I've been part of a dialogue with China through the Brookings Institution for the last few years on AI risks and mitigating risks in the relationship. And we often talk about things that we've been trying to typologize catastrophic risks. And one of the things that's come out of that conversation is a realization of how different countries can think about what those risks are. And I think whenever you have an emerging technology that's this revolutionary, there's a real potential that cuts across so many different sectors. There's a real potential that we don't understand each other's threat perspectives, that we don't understand. We've even seen this with cyber, but AI is just much more generative and cutting across lots of different possibilities. And so one actor can be thinking about one set of risks and really worried about it, and interpreting the other actor's moves in terms of that, while the other actor is completely unaware because it's not a threat they're considering. And so I think it's really important, both domestically in terms of stakeholders engagement and internationally, that we be doing the best we can to understand how all actors, stakeholders, peers, adversaries, allies alike, and different stakeholders within society are thinking about the frictions that AI produces, thinking about the risks it creates for them, and those may or may not be catastrophic. I mean, we can talk about the sort of escalatory scenarios, crisis stability, nuclear, or the cross-cutting with other generative technologies that could cause huge loss of life, like synthetic biology, or the effects of additive manufacturing and AI combined on proliferation threats. Some of these really are catastrophic potential, but I think the bigger takeaway would be, in order to understand what you're balancing in any regulatory or policy decisions, you need to be thinking about what the risks are from everyone's perspective, and practicing some sort of strategic empathy and understanding that as best as you can by having information flow so that you are having conversations with everyone. And you need to be thinking about it in terms of future effects, which can be quite difficult when you don't know where the technology will be in 5-10 years, but you just need to game that out in every way that makes you think creatively and outside the box about things that aren't your immediate bullseye. And then on a more granular level, I just was in a conversation this morning at NDU about how we should integrate this into teaching. And of course, there are all sorts of risks about people not learning skills we want them to learn. And I think this is true across government and all sectors. It's really important they understand the failure modes. It's really important they understand what the technology can and can't do and how to know the difference. And they're only going to learn those things by playing with it in safe environments first.
Yeah. I love all the different calls for understanding. I'm going to add one more. We want the federal government to understand what's happening inside the frontier AI development companies. And to do that, the Center for AI Policy suggests passing the bicameral bipartisan whistleblower protection bill recently introduced by Senator Grassley. Thank you so much to our amazing panel. We have the room for a little while longer if people want to mingle.
Thank you.